Welcome to all of you. Glad you're here. Glad you found us. The Socratic Club has met for, I think this is our 8th year, 7th year, 8th year, something like that. And we have met almost always in College Hall 101, but there's a class there this time this semester. So here we are in the basement of Jepson, and I'm glad you all found us. Welcome. The Gonzaga Socratic Club takes its name from the Oxford Socratic Club of the mid-1900s, which was an organization. The club name is a little misleading. I have students, in fact, I just got an email from a student this past week asking, how do I join? Well, you join by showing up. But the Oxford Socratic Club, our namesake, was an organization that was founded to promote a discussion about Christian worldview issues that was not speaking to a small subculture audience, but was speaking to the university as a whole. And we try to do the same sort of thing here at the Gonzaga Socratic Club. So we often will touch on issues like the problem of evil, or secularism, or Christianity and science, all sorts of things like that. So if you haven't been to a meeting before, welcome. There is an email sign-up sheet, or you can just go to our website, which you can find easily just by looking under Gonzaga Socratic Club and pull it up on Google or show. But we do try to address those questions that connect Christianity to really broader worldview issues. Who are we? What are we all about? Often thinking about mission here at Gonzaga and so on and so forth. We are very pleased today to have a colleague from across town and a friend of Gonzaga in a lot of different ways. Dr. Dale Soden is a professor of history at Whitworth University, and he directs the Weyerhaeuser Center for Christian Faith and Learning. I'm not looking at my script notes.
Perfect.
Yeah, okay, that's it. Which is an organization that is similar to and works with Gonzaga's Faith and Reason Institute on a number of initiatives, including occasional conferences. So Dale has done quite a bit to work with folks at Gonzaga over the years. You know, just 50 to 100 years ago, there were important Christians who spoke to the wider culture. And yet we find ourselves in the early 2000s, and it's hard to find anyone who speaks to our broad culture at all, much less Christians, we might say. And what Dale is going to do today is explore some of the reasons why there's been a decline in Christian public intellectuals, and maybe we'll get a chance to think also and a bit prospectively about what we can do, what are ways that Christians can find voices to contribute to public society. So, welcome, Professor Soden.
Thank you. Thanks, David. Great to be with you. This is such a cool deal. I wish we had it at Whitworth. It's just, first of all, amazing that you would come out at 4 o'clock Friday afternoon and be a part of this. But I think it really speaks well of you individually and your professors, and it's, again, just a great delight for me, as David said, a long relationship with Gonzaga. It's one of the great benefits of staying in a place for a length of time. One of the cool things about the academy is that you can develop collegial relationships. And I want to first of all acknowledge your academic vice president, Patricia Killen. She's been a longtime friend and colleague, and enormously helpful to me as we speak. She's helping me on another project, and it's just really a neat thing. I've known Professor Bowman. Our kids played basketball together for a long time, and so we have a kind of neat friendship as much around basketball as anything else. And the Conches I've known for years, and they've been a part of many things that we've done together. And of course, David, and then Eric Cunningham in history, who will say some things. But again, you're fortunate here at Gonzaga to have people who will put the energy and organization into something like this, because to me this is what makes for a great liberal arts education and institution. Well, let me tell you just a little bit about how I got involved with this. Several years ago, I was involved in something called the Lutheran Academy of Scholars, and I was raised in the Lutheran Church and still claim a Lutheran identity with Pacific Lutheran University before doing my graduate work. And the question of that academy was centered around Lutheran public life, Lutheran public policy, and the question arose as to why there weren't more identifiable Lutheran voices within the public square, so to speak. And so I started thinking a little bit about that. But more recently, started thinking about, much as David said, where are the Christian public intellectuals? Where are the Protestant public intellectuals in particular? And so I got a little bit of money from the Lilly Foundation to come up with a course, a one-credit course for students last spring. I invited 10 students when we shared some interests, and we started with actually having Takaches come over and a couple of professors from Gonzaga, and met with several of my colleagues from Whitworth, and talking a little bit about this whole issue of what it meant to be a public intellectual, who's a public intellectual, and what it meant to be a Christian, and what is the difference, if any, between a Protestant and a Catholic public intellectual. And so that started me thinking a little bit more, and that's really the gist of the remarks I'll make. I'm going to stay with some prepared remarks, and then Eric's going to respond, but hopefully we can involve ourselves in some conversation, because I've changed a little bit. It doesn't make much difference. The title of this is more now Protestant and Catholic Public Intellectuals' Appeals to Original Sin and Natural Law, because my own interest, probably particularly in this, is what ideas are either compelling to people within the broader public life, and are those ideas particularly rooted in the Christian tradition? And if so, what are those? Well, you at Gonzaga most recently hosted one of America's leading public intellectuals, Thomas Friedman, in the President's series. They would come over for that, and that was fun to see him. But as David says, my own interest is really in what are the underlying ideas that these public intellectuals begin to operate with, or what are the assumptions that inform their particular comment on culture or politics in the broader public square. Again, whether or not they have an identifiable view of human nature, what are their assumptions about good and evil, power, race, class, gender, many of the categories that you would be in the courses that you are taking. But as he said, and as I've indicated, my particular interest has been in whether or not we can identify Christian public intellectuals. In the case of Friedman, he's Jewish. David Brooks, who regularly writes in the New York Times and was featured on the NewsHour with Mark Shields. Brooks is Jewish, Mark Shields is Catholic. So all of that kind of led me, to this particular interest. I think it's one thing to note, as we currently are, which party is more religious than the other. And you've been probably following this, that there are 12 mentions of God in the Republican platform, and a lot of criticism of the Democratic platform originally, that it had eliminated God, although there are references to the importance of faith and faith commitments in terms of social and public life, and insert that. But it's another thing, really, to ask what ideas are really informing those public policies and our public life together. I found it interesting that some 5 years ago, David Brooks, maybe some of you saw this or remember this, but asked in an interview of candidate Barack Obama whether he had ever read any of the works of a Protestant theologian, Reinhold Niebuhr. And apparently, to Brooks' surprise, candidate Obama indicated that not only had he read Niebuhr, but that he was one of his favorite thinkers. Although someone who has been interested in Niebuhr since my graduate days at the University of Washington studying American intellectual history, I was struck by candidate Obama's comment. It caused me to think again about the influence of and the status really of mainline Protestant intellectual voices in our culture since particularly the 1960s. And for as much as I personally admire Niebuhr, have tried to read Niebuhr fairly carefully, I wondered why Obama had not mentioned someone else. And the trouble was that I had difficulty identifying other Protestant thinkers in the last 40 years who might have exercised that influence on Barack Obama, with maybe the exception of one that we surely know did influence him, and that was Martin Luther Jr. But I came to the conclusion that on the whole, there weren't that many, at least easily identifiable Protestant public intellectuals from which to choose. So it led me essentially to this question that we're talking about today is, well, why would that be the case? Or is there any identifiable, hello Margaret, good to see you, set of reasons for all of that? And that's what I love us, before we quit today, to have a repeated and own feedback, because these are still developing thoughts. I don't find too much that's being written out there to try to give explanation for this. And so, not that this is particularly original, but again, there's just not a lot that you can point to. If it's easy, you can say, well, so-and-so, give just a good explanation for why this is the case. Well, I want to go down this path by first of all asserting that the most salient, and this may be very debatable, but the most salient Protestant critique of culture and politics has indeed rested on the cluster of ideas that we associate with original sin. And secondly, the most common Catholic critique, maybe less culture, maybe it is, Catholic critique of culture has been grounded in ideas associated with natural law. So those are the two compelling ideas, and what I want to try to lay out are ways in which those ideas have been used to make the case fairly briefly that Protestants, and here I'll focus primarily on Niebuhr, have indeed relied heavily on original sin, and that Catholic public intellectuals, again, speaking to a primarily Catholic audience, I'm sure, would be generally aware of the way natural law has been appealed to over and over again in the context of public policy. Okay, so let me again reiterate that the most important, my contention is the most important Orthodox doctrine, Orthodox Christian doctrine that has informed Protestant comment about society and culture is the doctrine of original sin. If we had time, we could unpack Luther and Calvin and Knox and a bevy of Puritan thinkers, and of course Reinhold Niebuhr, to try to make this case a little bit more compelling. If that's what we want to argue. But I'm just putting this out there as an assertion, which again maybe some or many of you want to challenge. Let me say a little bit more about Niebuhr and at least the way in which, generally speaking, he used the concept of original sin to engage public life. Born in 1892, Wright City, Missouri, to German immigrant parents, died in 1971. Was ordained into the German Evangelical Church after going to seminary and Yale Divinity School. Niebuhr was primarily known as a Protestant theologian, but he was a pastor in Detroit from 1915 to 1928. He also became a noted social reformer from 1928 to 1952 as a professor of theology at Union Theological Seminary in New York. He was an influential voice on a wide range of issues, including politics, ethics, and foreign policy. He was a strong supporter of the United States intervention in the war in Europe, but in 1946, a drafter and signatory to the Federal Council of Churches' statement that atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was, quote, morally indefensible. If highly acclaimed in some liberal circles because of some of these positions, Niebuhr became better known for his critique of liberalism's undue optimism regarding the human condition. Instead, Niebuhr became known for his hard-nosed realism, and that realism was based on his deep reflection on the implications of original sin. His most influential books were Moral Man and Moral Society, 1932, Nature and Destiny of Man, 1943, Children of Light and Children of Darkness, 1944, and The Irony of American History, 1952. He was on the cover of Time magazine in March 1948, and recognized as, if not the leading Protestant public theologian, certainly right up there at the top. Well, as suggested, the strength of his critique of American culture and politics, I think in most people's minds, was really rooted in this idea of original sin. Noted historian Arthur Schlesinger became a fan of Niebuhr's, wrote this. He said, traditionally, the idea of the frailty of man led to the demand for obedience to ordained authority. But Niebuhr rejected that ancient conservative argument. Ordained authority, he showed, is all the more subject to the temptations of self-interest, self-deception, self-righteousness. Those were the themes that drove much of Niebuhr's work. Again, self-interest, self-deception, self-righteousness, whether those were individually expressed or collectively expressed. Power must be balanced by power, according to Niebuhr. He persuaded Schlesinger and many of his contemporaries that original sin provides a far stronger foundation for freedom and self-government than illusions about human perfectibility. Niebuhr's analysis was grounded in the Christianity of Augustine and Calvin, but he had nonetheless a special affinity with secular circles. His warnings against utopianism, messianism, and perfectionism struck a chord in much of Schlesinger's generation. Schlesinger said, "We cannot play the role of God to history," now commenting on Niebuhr, "and we must strive as best we can to attain decency, clarity, and proximate justice in an ambiguous world." In an Atlantic Monthly article written in 2007, writer Paul Elie noted that virtually all of the ways in which people draw upon Niebuhr have something to do with his belief in the selfish nature of human beings. Elie pointed out that Niebuhr appealed to realists as, quote, the polemical journalist who undertook to convert liberal Protestantism from its perfectionist illusions in the interventionist political debates at a time when Hitler threatened the whole of Western culture. Elie reminds us, quote, Niebuhr offered a devastating critique of the yearning for purity and the radical forms that this yearning takes, whether the Christian wishes to purify society of sin, fundamentalist, or the rationalist wishes to purify society of religion and other superstitions. Again, these, he said, a Christian realism rooted in a sense of human sinfulness. Everybody's motives are mixed. Niebuhr's long perspective, the sense of history being understood from a distance, even as it's happening, was the source of his authority, according to Elie. He spent the rest of his career spelling out this sense of history in even greater depth. His biblical sense of history, profoundly influenced by his view of original sin and what he calls the limits of all human striving, is what makes his account of American striving still ring true. For him, history is not a record of past events, but a history of human injustice and divine mercy. The ongoing, little changing story of, quote, the curious compounds of good and evil, in which the actions of the best men and nations abound. And again, referring back to David Brooks' interview with Barack Obama in 2007, Obama said, quote, I take away from Niebuhr the compelling idea that there's serious evil in the world and hardship and pain. And we should be humble and modest in our belief we can eliminate those things. But we shouldn't use this as an excuse for cynicism and inaction. I take away the sense that we have to make these efforts knowing they are hard and not swinging from naive idealism to bitter realism. Okay, so the point that I want to make with this is simply that, at least in the case of Reinhold Niebuhr, perhaps again the most prominent Protestant public intellectual, at least through the middle of the 20th century, and if you obviously, take Barack Obama's comments about him, well into the late 20th, even 21st century, still original sin was at the core of his cultural critique. Okay, now let me shift to the Catholic side of the ledger and make may what be obvious to this audience, and the principal lens from which to critique culture and politics has been the use of natural law. And most of you may be familiar with John Courtney Murray, who was ordained in 1933, received his doctorate in theology from Gregorian University in Rome, 1937, returned to teach theology at Woodstock College in Maryland. He was the first priest to be a visiting professor at Yale in 1951, and became editor of the journal Theological Studies in 1941, and was instrumental in making it the premier journal for Catholic theology in the United States. As one intellectual historian asserted, quote, "No single person did more than John Courtney Murray to provide a theoretical basis for the more complete involvement of Catholics in the intellectual life of the United States." He was a vigorous opponent of Paul Blanchard, who charged that Catholic leadership was too authoritarian to be consistent with democratic institutions. In 1960, Murray published a book constructing American democratic ideology in terms that made it seem closer to medieval Catholic doctrines than to secular philosophers of the Enlightenment. Murray relied heavily on the notion of natural law. He believed that there were discernible universal truths embedded in the fabric of the moral universe that were accessible to all human beings. His interest in self-evident truths, or again, these that would underscore natural law, were best revealed in his book, We Hold These Truths, Catholic Reflections on the American Proposition. Second Catholic public intellectual who relied heavily on natural law was a convert. This was Richard John Newhouse. Newhouse's roots were in the Missouri Synod of the Lutheran Church. After being ordained, Newhouse accepted a call to the predominantly black parish in Brooklyn. An activist in the civil rights movement, he marched with King and Selma and came to oppose the war in Vietnam. But in those years, Newhouse was one of the first major civil rights activists to identify the pro-life cause with moral truths on which the civil rights movement had staked its claim. He became a major figure in American pro-life activism, providing ideas and arguments for the pro-life movement for 40 years. By the late 1970s, he was identified as a neoconservative, and in 1990, he founded what would become the Institute on Religion and Public Life in New York. The Institute's journal, First Things, which many of you are familiar with, which Newhouse was editor-in-chief, became one of the premier journals of religiously informed thought. In that same year, Newhouse left the Lutheran Church and converted to Catholicism, and a year later was ordained as a priest of the Archdiocese of New York. He became a frequent commentator for the Catholic Church. While Newhouse certainly did not abandon the concept of original sin as a formative idea in his political and social thinking, he found the concept of natural law to be a powerful idea from which to state his core convictions. His oft-cited essay, The Politics of Bioethics, in the November 2007 issue of First Things, is a great example of his reliance on natural law. His last book, before his death in 2009, American Babylon, Notes of a Christian Exile, covers many fronts, but it clearly is an expression of his belief in the reality of natural law and its importance for thinking about politics and morals. Another example of a Catholic public intellectual who relies heavily on natural law is George Weigel. He's an American author, political, social activist, currently serves as a distinguished senior fellow of the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Weigel was the founding president of the James Madison Foundation. He's the author of the best-selling biography, Pope John Paul II, Witness to Hope, and Tranquilitas, Worthiness, the Present Failure and Future Promise of American Catholic Thought on War and Peace. Just this past May, Weigel gave the commencement address at the Benedictine College in Atchison, Kansas, defending religious freedom in full, a generation's challenge. And to me, it's again a great example of his appeal to the use of natural law. Let me just read a few passages here. We share today, this is Weigel now, a unique and critical moment in the history of the Catholic Church in the United States. At the time of the American Revolution, Catholics accounted for less than 1% of the population of the 13 colonies. A tiny population, clustered primarily in my native Maryland and a few Pennsylvania counties. Yet within a few decades of the founding, the great tides of European immigration that began to wash under the shores of the new nation, those huddled masses yearning to breathe free, those 19th century immigrants felt the sting of anti-Catholic prejudice, even anti-Catholic violence. But notwithstanding that bigotry, Catholics have, I believe, always felt at home in these United States. We have felt home because we have thrived here. With the exception of immigrant Jews, no religious group has prospered more in America than the Catholic community. Catholic participation in the American consensus has been full and free, unreserved, unembarrassed, because the contents of this consensus, the ethical and political principles drawn from the tradition of natural law, approve themselves to the Catholic intelligence and conscience. Where this kind of language is talked, the Catholic joins the conversation with complete ease. It is his language. The ideas expressed are native to his universe of discourse. Even the accent, being American, suits his tongue. In the second decade of the third millennium, there are many grave questions being debated in America. The question of the legal protection of innocent human life from conception until natural death. The question of long-term strategy and morally worthy tactics in the war against Islam and jihadism. The question of how we attend to the sick and how we manage immigration. The question of fitting public policy ends to fiscal means. The question of building an appropriate regulatory structure around the biotech revolution so that the new genetic knowledge leads to genuine human flourishing rather than to a stunted and manufactured humanity. The question of the health of American civil society and American national character. The list goes on and on. Yet amidst all this churning, the gravest question of our public culture is whether what Father Murray, I mentioned earlier, called the American consensus, that ensemble of ethical, political principles drawn from the tradition of natural law, still holds. He says there are reasons to be concerned. In October 2009, the nation's political newspaper of record, the Washington Post, ran an editorial condemning what it termed the, quote, extremist views of the candidate for Attorney General of Virginia, who suggested that the natural moral law was still a useful guide to public policy. For it suggested the label bigot ought to be applied to notable historical personalities who appeal to natural moral law and causes the Post would presumably regard as admirable figures like Thomas Jefferson, stating America's claim to independent nationhood on, again, self-evident moral truths derived from the laws of nature. Or Martin Luther King Jr. arguing in a letter from the Birmingham jail that, quote, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal and natural law. Or Pope John Paul II, who at the United Nations in 1995 suggested that the truths of the natural moral law, the moral logic which is built into human life, as he put it, could serve as a universal grammar. Appeals to the natural moral law we can know by reason underwrote, this is again vital, the American Civil Rights Revolution. Appeals to the same natural moral law underwrite the pro-life movement, the successor to the Civil Rights Movement, and appeals to the natural moral law have underwritten U.S. international human rights policy for the past 30 years. So all of this is to, again, reinforce my basic contention that Protestants have relied on original sin and Catholics more so on natural law. So now the question is really whether or not these ideas still provide a suitable foundation for Protestant and Catholic public intellectuals to engage the larger intellectual community. And my general assertion is that natural law is holding up better than original sin. And my general assertion is simply that that's one of the most important reasons why there are more Catholic public intellectuals out there. I don't really have a good way of counting them or enumerating them. It's just more by a sort of general observation and feel than it is by a hardcore empirical study of who's one and the other. But my thesis, more or less, is that together a little more firmly than the other. Okay, so let me say a little bit more about the general criticism of original sin, and then also what some of the criticisms that are out there of natural law, and then sort of what do we make of all of this, and then I'll stop and let Eric respond. Okay. Going back to Arthur Schlesinger, who wrote about the appeal to him of a Reinhold Niebuhr, but in that essay he also suggested what a tough slog original sin was, certainly by the time that Niebuhr was talking about it. So the notion of sinful man was uncomfortable for my generation. We had been brought up to believe in human innocence and even in human perfectibility. This was less a liberal delusion than an expression of an all-American DNA, meaning that our culture generally, since Puritan England, is more comfortable with, again, a much more positive view of human nature, whether you want to move in the Enlightenment or the Romantic period or whatever, American democracy, that's, I think, what he's meaning by the American DNA. Andrew Carnegie had articulated the national faith and had proclaimed the rise of man from lower to higher forms. He declared, quote, "Nor is there any conceivable end to this march to perfection." In 1939, Charles Merriman of the University of Chicago, the Dean of American Political Scientists, wrote in, quote, "The New Democracy and New Despotism. There is a constant trend in human affairs toward the perfectibility of mankind." This was plainly stated at the time of the French Revolution and has been reasserted ever since that time with increasing plausibility. Human ignorance and unjust institutions remain the only obstacles to a more perfect world. The proper education of individuals and proper reform of institutions did their job. Such obstacles would be removed. For the heart of man was okay. The idea of original sin was a historical, indeed hysterical, curiosity that should have evaporated with Jonathan Edwards' Calvinism. Perhaps as challenging, though, in our own era would be all of the ways in which we have come to think about the human condition differently. Certainly behavioral psychology, which stipulates that human beings are best understood as the product of our environment, or again, more recently in the last several decades, evolutionary psychology, stipulating that human behavior is in a constant adaptive state, working for the perpetuation of our gene pool, or certainly the work that's going on in neuroscience that's suggesting that all behavior can be traced to function of the brain, make, I think, the association with original sin, the concept of original sin, more problematic. Now, there may be other reasons, but I would suggest that just given the nature of our culture, which generally speaking is more optimistic in its understanding of who we are as human beings, and really the intellectual world that we live in, that for people to keep coming back to original sin as a primary way of understanding who we are and therefore using it as a critique of American culture is hard work, and one that, again, I don't necessarily want to say that explains the absence of Protestants, because obviously there's still Protestants out there, and many of them are finding different ways of engaging in public life. But I would say that that's a significant issue. At least that's what I'm interested in exploring. On the natural law side, I've operated with the general assumption that the idea was, again, more palatable to intellectuals or a broader literary audience, perhaps because it corresponds, again, several references to Jefferson and self-evident truths and natural law in varying forms within our culture, or a correspondence to a belief in universal human rights, or perhaps because it's more accessible through the proper use of reason. There may be a number of reasons why natural law would have greater appeal and greater utility to people who were Christian, but also not necessarily Christian. That they, again, it would be an idea that would have again, greater appeal. But you start down this path and you start looking for criticisms of natural law, and again, there are lots of philosophers in the room, and you're much better than I to talk about some of the challenges associated with natural law, but almost inevitably you do find the problem of definition. Arthur Harding, for example, in The Origins of Natural Law says, The concepts are as most varied as philosophical systems which have evolved in the history of Western civilization. Either we must define natural law so broadly as to involve no fixed content or metaphysic or definition on the order of anything referring to nature and morality any way at all, or we must propose a definition that knowingly covers less than absolutely everything associated with the development of natural law. According to ethicist Daniel Heimbach, proponents of natural law have divided over whether the principle by which one determines what is normative in nature is itself rooted in nature or is beyond nature and only reflected in nature. And that gets into a particular philosophic argument. But that is whether a morally normative in nature involves nothing more than describing what occurs in nature or consists of purposes or directions with plans or how nature should work, and in reference to which one may evaluate natural occurrences as either good or bad. Is it nature or God that provides the basis for what we understand in natural law? Heimbach further argues that non-Christians and Christians will, for a while, agree on common standards discoverable in nature without seeming to require faith in anything beyond nature. But after most in the culture lose faith in God, his assertion is, and deny that nature depends on anything supernatural, it becomes increasingly difficult for Christians to find common moral ground, and non-Christians relying on nothing more than nature as it is. Okay, all of that said about some of the problems associated with natural law, it still seems to me that natural law is holding up better just as an idea and in terms of what people have been interested in. Okay, so where do we go from here? It seems that on the face of it, that Catholic intellectuals, public intellectuals, are still showing no signs of abandoning natural law. That's the principal way in which Catholic public intellectual will engage the culture. On the Protestant side, it is more complex, I think, because of the problems associated, at least indirectly, with original sin. It's interesting to me that over the last several years, there are several books that have been published that have indicated Protestant re-engagement with the idea of natural law. Now, we might associate that mostly with evangelicals who are looking to make a natural law argument, for example, on abortion or perhaps homosexuality, but it goes far beyond that. For example, Robert Baker, Roland Elke's Natural Law, a Lutheran Reappraisal, and J. Darrell Charles, Retrieving the Natural Law, a Return to Moral First Things, and David Van Drunen's Natural Law and the Two Kingdoms, a study of the development of Reformed social thought, all have attracted scholarly attention. I'm not saying those are widely read or known out there, but what it indicates is that whether they're Protestant philosophers or theologians, there is an interest in re-engaging natural law, reappropriating it in part. In a review article where this appeared in the Christian Scholars Review last year, Jordan Baylor wrote, "These recent writers," referring to Backer and Charles and Van Drunen, among others, have shown conclusively that natural law thinking belongs in the arsenal of contemporary Protestant social thought, and particularly those working from traditions associated with the magisterial Reformation. The German theologian and pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer once wrote that when the Christian witness in and to the world today, quote, "We must replace rusty weapons with bright steel." As these works make clear, the Protestant rediscovery, reappraisal, redeployment of natural law are absolutely essential to furnishing the bright steel and reinvigorating Protestant social thought. But lest one think original sin is entirely dead, one can find occasional reference to it in at least some compatibility with it, I suppose, in the writings of David Brooks. Maybe some of you saw this editorial he wrote on the Jerry Sandusky affair last year. But Brooks wrote the following, which I find interesting. In centuries past, people built moral systems that acknowledged this weakness. These systems emphasized our sinfulness. They reminded people of the evil within themselves. Life was seen as an inner struggle against the selfish forces inside. These vocabularies made people aware of how their weaknesses manifested themselves and how to exercise discipline over them. These systems gave people categories with which to process savagery and scripts to follow when they're confronted. They help people make moral judgments and hold people responsible amidst our frailties. But we're not Puritans anymore. We live in a society oriented around, yes, I love this line, our inner wonderfulness. So when something atrocious happens, people look for something artificial, outside force that must have caused it, like the culture of college football or some other favorite bogey. People look for laws that can be changed, and so it never happens again. Commentators ruthlessly vilify all involved on the island of their own innocence. Everyone gets to proudly ask, how could they have let this happen? The proper question is, how can we ourselves overcome our natural tendency to evade and self-deceive? This was the proper question after Abu Ghraib, Madoff, the Wall Street Follies, and 1,000 other scandals. But it's a question this society has a hard time asking, because the most seductive evasion is the one that leads us to deny the underside of our own nature. So I do find it ironic that it's a Jewish intellectual, not a Protestant intellectual, making this case. So perhaps the question for us at institutions like Gonzaga and Whitworth is not so much about whether natural law belongs in our arsenal of social thought, but whether original sin is compelling enough to make to maintain its role or even reemerge as a part of that arsenal among Christian public intellectuals. Although Protestants increasingly take the Richard John Newhouse route, and if not convert to Catholicism, at least find their way back to natural law. Let me stop here. Thank you.
It's the practice at the Socratic Club to have a respondent to help spur our discussion. Professor Eric Cunningham of the History Department here at Gonzaga will serve that laudable function today for us.
Thank you very much. Am I sort of in your...
Yeah, you're fine.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for being here for the first Socratic Club presentation of the year. It's always an honor to be invited to speak at these, and I've enjoyed my association with this Socratic Club immensely over the years. So thank you, Dr. Calhoun, and especially my across from Best Buddy Dale Soden from Whitworth for providing the venue as well as this very interesting topic. I found Dr. Soden's paper and his question very thought-provoking. The topic of public intellectuals is not something that I normally think of. But the context, which is intellectual life in the public sphere of modern society, is something of a preoccupation. So I've enjoyed having this opportunity to order my thoughts a little bit. In pondering his question, which isn't exactly the same question as where did all the Christian public intellectuals go, I'll try to deal with both in the short time that I have. This question, it occurs to me that I don't think that the high modern paradigm of the public intellectual even exists. And if it does, I'm not sure that our public intellectuals, Christian or otherwise, care much at all about original sin or natural law. They seem to be talking about other things that derive from other kinds of assumptions. Try to answer the question in 30 seconds. If I'm answering a question in the history of the 12th place, for example, this might sound familiar to you. So, I mean, maybe the combined effects of the Renaissance, the Reformation, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, has pretty much resulted in a fairly widespread secularization of society. So much so that we've erected an iron wall of separation between Christian thought and public thought. And maybe the Christian public intellectual isn't entirely welcome in the public sphere. But that's an oversimplification of the problem, I'm sure. And it doesn't do credit, it doesn't do justice to Dr. Soden's very nuanced questions about the differences between these two large discourses of originality and natural law. He used Reinhold Niebuhr and John Courtney Murray as exemplars, Protestant and Catholic public intellectuals. And he observes that their critiques or commentaries on American society are more or less derived from foundational assumptions of original sin or natural law, respectively. And while Dr. Soden didn't say this directly, I gleaned from his paper a suggestion that the first of these assumptions, original sin, might lead to public policies aimed at correcting what's wrong, while the latter, natural law, might lead to the formation of a public consciousness, right, that could be used to encourage people to configure themselves to a higher order of virtue. And maybe I'm reading too much. And if I am, then this next comment will certainly be a great leap. Original sin, public intellectualism, would tend to be left-leaning intellectualism, and natural law, public intellectualism, would be much more the right-leaning intellectualism. And maybe the people that line up on the natural law debate, especially now, those are the people you mentioned, would tend to fall into the category of conservative thinkers. But again, when I think about this, the real bifurcation of public intellectual life is this left versus right divide. Complete with all of the power skirmishes between the left and the right that keep this split open and growing, almost to the point of coming into it silently. It may be that right versus left is a byproduct of the debate on original sin versus natural law. But it seems to me that even the politicized version of this particular dynamic is already irrelevant of the bygone 20th century. The first people that came to my mind when the great debate was thinking public intellectualism, original sin, natural law, I immediately thought of Alan Dershowitz and William F. Buckley. I don't know why, maybe watching too many episodes of The Firing Line in high school or something. But these two amazing thinkers engaged in a long series of, I think, brilliant debates on the Firing Line show over the course of many years. And Dershowitz, of course, is still a brilliant liberal Jewish attorney for whom racism, sexism, homophobia, and all forms of social discrimination are essentially equivalent to original sin. And Buckley, a Catholic journalist, was, I guess, the living embodiment of post-World War II conservatism and a great contributor to the rhetoric of civic virtue that attended conservative revival. So, but when I try to locate something resembling a Protestant versus Catholic debate here, I am unsuccessful. And Buckley, despite his own brilliance as an author and his lifelong outspoken support for the Catholic Church, was not a man who successfully conveyed the depth of his faith through his written works. His religious autobiography, which was called Nearer My God to Thee, was very disappointing even at the low price of $2.90. Great big box at Barnes & Noble. But Buckley was a good bona fide natural law man, but he was not a Catholic public intellectual in the mold of George Whitefield, or Richard John Newhouse. So thinking about that, it occurred to me that very few Catholic intellectuals are. It's been my observation that the many Catholic public intellectuals today, or maybe many Catholic people broadcasting their ideas in the public square, will use their Catholic faith as at least in part, as a way to challenge traditional Catholic teaching. Right? Being Catholic gives them space to publicly undermine whatever church teaching happens to be under attack by the dominant culture at any given moment. So we've heard, it's not uncommon to hear Catholic elites make pronouncements to the effect, I'm a Catholic and I support abortion rights, leaving you with the impression that this is kind of a Catholic teaching, right? And a lot of Catholics certainly believe this, but it's not really a Catholic public intellectual kind of argument. They'd probably say the same thing about the almost automatic response of the Episcopalian clergy, the automatic acquiescence, perhaps, to the left-leaning side of any debate on social justice, whether it runs counter to Protestant theology or not. Now, the people can think that the that's not the question. But, I mean, I'm racking my brain on this. I don't think we really have a spirited debate of civic values rooted in that old-time religion anymore. And it seems hard to detect any conscious or unconscious adherence to either a standpoint of original sin or natural law in any explicitly non-religious debate. So I don't think, again, I don't think we have a real modern public intellectual sphere. I think what we have is a public sphere in which certain kinds of conversations take place. And the gatekeepers to this sphere are the universities and the media. Now, it's been my experience, and I'm willing to be corrected by anybody who has real evidence for than otherwise, that both the academy and the media are predominantly secular and predominantly left-leaning. So if the public debate, as I've suggested, is a division between right and left, rather than Protestant original sin and natural law, then the public debate is at least a somewhat one-sided debate, at least as far as the mainstream public arena goes. The internet and the guerrilla media seem to be doing just fine, and actually do provide a forum for a wide range of philosophical positions. And as we know, TV viewers in particular are leaving the so-called mainstream media in droves. So something's not making sense. It was interesting to read some weeks ago that both the Democratic and the Republican national conventions were beaten in the ratings by Here Comes Honey Boo Wednesday night, which is just an amazing thing to think of, as the world is literally on fire. It makes total sense, right? So we do need a balanced public intellectual life, and we need good, moral, virtuous public intellectuals. But I think we're probably better off logging on to TED Talks on the internet than waiting for an academic journal or a Sunday morning press show to satisfy that particular need. In closing, let me just wrap this up. I want to make one pass at answering the question, where have all the Christian public intellectuals gone? I would say that they have left the public arena, where they're not particularly welcome, and have moved into other arenas. There are any number of brilliant thinkers populating the Christian evangelical areas. But like any other special interest group, they seem to be talking to their own constituencies, and they seem to be just circling the wagons around their own ideology. So finally, in the sense that the public, if the public intellectual sphere is a problem, and I think it is, I think the gatekeepers have let the public down. The gatekeepers being the media and the academy. But for a public that thinks that the X factor is an intellectual forum, I'm not sure there's any real blame to be laid on it. But I will say, and they'll get us up with a huge kind of question. I agree with Dale that this topic is and will remain, what did you say, the subject of interest and intense scrutiny. But I have a feeling that the terms of the debate will have to shift away from the concerns of a modernized Judeo-Christian debate and move towards something that's closer to the source of human experience, something more universally encompassing. Maybe then, should that happen, there might be a true, if not a resuscitation of original sin or natural law as the core of the debate, then the resuscitation of a true debate. So anyway, that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Eric, why don't you stay up there, and Dale, if you wouldn't mind, if you want to pull a chair up, you can sit down or you can stand, whatever you'd like. So, questions, comments?
Do you have a particular definition of what a public intellectual?
generally someone who speaks in a forum that's pretty widely read. I don't think you can be considered a public intellectual if you're, you just got your, your narrow blog or hardly anyone outside of your immediate circle of friends knows who you are. So that's why I sort of start with these people who write for the Times or the Coast or the Atlantic Monthly, or have books that are, and again, that's where a Friedman, for example, I don't know what the ceiling is, or the, in terms of how many books you have to sell in order to be widely recognized, but there's a threshold, it seems to me, that you have to generally meet in order to be a public intellectual.
And also what makes them an intellectual, because a lot of people
Right.
like public media, and that person is not an intellectual.
Yeah. Well, again, you ask really good questions, and I don't have really good answers. I think when you find people who their discourse involves ideas of a certain magnitude, and they're not just simply describing policy as it's going forward, but there's something that they're unpacking that reveals larger assumptions about political theory or human behavior. There's an element of philosophy, I think, social and political philosophy, that you have to operate with in order to be a public intellectual. Now you can find people in the arts, but I think it's more those in politics, theology, philosophy that are committed to engaging larger.
What about in the sciences? I mean, aren't a lot of our intellectuals are scientists now?
Yeah, no, I think that's true. E.O. Wilson, would be an important public intellectual. Richard Dawkins, and so
Charles Taylor.
Excuse me, Charles Taylor. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, maybe you all have a better way of defining that. It's just sort of when you see it, sort of thing, as opposed to having a really precise definition of what constitutes public and intellectual. Yeah.
I was wondering, not what makes an intellectual or even a public intellectual, but specifically a Christian public intellectual. Are you looking for someone who's wholly and inseparably rooted in their faith, that everything they say and everything they do is consciously and subconsciously based in a Christian identity?
When you say holy, probably not. I don't, but I think that it means that your identity as a Christian, whether that's whatever expression of Christianity you identify with, is influential. It doesn't have to be the only influence or the only source of thought that you're putting out there, but if you're an intellectual, and even though you might identify with a particular church or faith expression, and there's nothing in that you can identify or anybody else can identify that is rooted in that, then I don't think it makes no sense to me that, well, that's a Christian public intellectual. But, if there's a conscious effort, and that's sort of at least my own interest in this, there's a conscious effort to draw, as the last example, let's say David Gross, of a philosophical tradition, and whether he wants to move into a Christian or a biblical tradition, condition. That to me is a self-conscious effort to integrate the world in which he's examining. And to me, that makes the most sense, I guess. David?
Yeah, I have a certain, I don't know how to say it. Would you think Mortimer Adler would be a Christian intellectual, granted that he's Jewish?
or was. I mean, his argument always was, well, I'm not a Christian because faith is a gift and I haven't received it. But all his argumentation is out of time. Now,
Yeah,
I mean,
I guess my general answer would be that if you're looking to locate these people, and Adler to me certainly fits this, where he's rooting his thought or his argument for the importance of Aquinas and Aristotle in the, that.
well, for the importance of the intellectual life.
Right. No, yeah.
Did Adler convert to Christianity?
I don't know that he ever did. I don't think so.
But I think it's, I mean, in this kind of discussion, I guess the interesting thing to me is where the root of his idea is. It's not so much existentially or at any one point whether he's this or that, but are there what you would say is identifiably religious ideas or theological ideas that are informing the thought in his effort to try to.
Well, and, excuse me, but the other thing would be that his intellectualism is a argumentative system based
Right.
upon assumptions that are found in the tradition.
Right.
And it is an attempt to engage the contemporary public potential
Right.
for action.
Right. No, and I think those are the kind of people that I'm kind of interested in at some level, and just what has happened to them. And I think, I think Eric had a lot of cogent points to make about whether or not they're, but yeah. Is it, so, well, just saying that, then how does that affect how you're thinking about it, or how should that affect how I'm thinking about it, or we're thinking about it?
Well, it seems to me that that the question of the public sphere is really a question of the critique that is brought to bear upon public life, however amorphous that might be in any given situation. And it doesn't have to be stated because I'm a Christian.
Right.
It's more, do I bring my understanding of the tradition to bear upon the public welfare or the public weal at this particular point?
Right.
And I don't have, the question then is the integrity of my argumentation.
Right.
Not where it ends up, or what my personal faith position happens to be. So I can be a liberal Catholic
Right.
and still argue out of a very strong traditional Catholic position.
Yeah, I think we're on the same page. I mean, and just in the general sense of being interested in those thinkers or individuals who bring ideas to bear on the public weal and public policy, and where those ideas come from, and which ideas are still salient, and which are less salient is really the larger interest for
I
myself.
just want to say one last thing and I'll shut up. I think it's important to understand that there is an enormous dimension of Christianity which doesn't have anything to do with original sin, and that's the East. All right, and the doctrine of original sin does not exist in Eastern Christianity. And it's more a notion of perfection or deification. And that makes a very big difference. And I'm not quite sure which difference it makes, because if you look at Eastern Christianity in terms of its critique of the common weal, one could argue, I think, that in Western Christianity there's a much more acute argument of the common weal than we find in the Eastern Church. And now I'll shut up.
Well, that's good, thanks. Yeah.
So I was wondering, with Catholics and Protestants different on original sin versus natural law, at least for the grounds of their critiques. Are there certain, because you gave your talk talking about the assumptions of each, are there certain general assumptions that both have to agree on, that indeed all intellectuals will have to agree on to be considered Christian? And if so, what are those? I mean, they have to be extremely broad, but what
Yeah, I
would
don't,
differentiate?
anyone else can respond to this. My first take on that is that not necessarily. I don't think that it's a believing in Trinity or a certain notion of the nature of God is required, or Christology is required for this. I think there are, what makes these ideas, I think interesting as they relate to sort of broader discussion of public life. One is pretty much focused on human nature, and almost any political philosophy has to come to grips with assumptions about human beings and human nature. And so that, to me, is one of the reasons that this particular expression has had some utility, is it can enter into that discourse. Likewise, if natural law is pretty much focused on what are higher laws, is there something that we can gauge our own customs and traditions or society by something that either seems self-evident or revealed either by reason, discovery, or whatever, intuition. I think that has utility to it because it helps us, in some sense, examine those larger social issues. But I don't think there has to be agreement on that in order to claim either Christianity or identity.
You're seeking to persuade. That's what a public intellectual would do. You're going to have to begin with some foundation of Christian and Jewish and Islamic assumptions. That's you're operating in a tradition. I'm a Christian intellectual. You're not going to start Satori. You're not going to start using a Buddhist vocabulary.
But I think you're not persuading them, you're not an evangelist specifically for Christianity. So the project isn't to get everyone to be Catholic or Protestant or Christian or whatever. The project is more having something thoughtful to say that is not being said, by in some sense whether it's one set of gatekeepers or the predominant mainstream intellectuals out there. It's how to offer to me a kind of prophetic word to what the prevailing intellectual mindset is on any board. And I think that's, to me, the potential value of a Christian, Jewish, or any tradition. I mean, if you're bringing what I would largely say is a prophetic word to our culture, prophetic in the sense it's different, it's challenging, it uproots the assumption. This is, to me, why Brooks is a fun guy to read for the most part, because he takes some delight in upsetting the apple cart by pointing to either the inconsistencies of our thought or the ways in which we once thought about this, no longer hold, but may still have some merit. And I think, again, his Jewishness helps him in that. It may not be the only thing, but it helps him bring a different word. Kathy?
Very provocative is your suggestion that we have focus basing on the concept of original sin as opposed to a focus on natural law. Something occurs to me that even tends to support that by looking some centuries earlier at the people who brought us the concept of inalienable rights, which then produce our Constitution. Several Dominican and Jesuit philosophers, especially the Spanish ones in the 17th and 18th, 16th centuries, who were responding to the encounter of the New World and the desire of many people to exploit the peoples, were involved in conceptualizing human nature universally and reasoning from that to it being wrong to enslave, to exploit other peoples. So that's, I don't know, that's so long ago historically, the whole notion of public intellectual would apply that. But it supports your notion of relying on natural law to influence policy and attention.
Thanks. Michael,
Well, when you were speaking, Dale, because I had the feeling it was you were holding up like an ideal Christian public intellectual. And then when my colleague Dr. Cunningham made his commentary, this ideal faded into a golden age suddenly. And I'm wondering, how is this relevant to your question? What's happened to all the Christian public intellectuals? One thing that occurs to me, though, is that there is such a strong element to psychologism in modern conceptions of religion, especially in America, and especially with respect to Christianity. And you have two kind of notions of sort of popular notions of religion. Religion is closely identified with culture, especially a foreign culture. That's the way we think of Islam, for example, or Buddhism, and so forth, right? And this is why to raise theological questions about such a religion is almost like insulting those people, in our popular imagination. That's one way of thinking of religion, but the other way of thinking of religion, this applies to modern American and contemporary American Christianity, is a strong tendency to what I'm calling psychologism. This focus in on religion as something eminently personal, and it's personal, it's therapeutic, it's my business, not yours. And theologically, of course, this goes with a kind of fideistic understanding of the nature of religious faith. That it's a matter of will or decision, and not a matter of intellectual assessment. And I'm wondering if maybe the fact that religion has come to be seen so much in this way. I'm not so much talking about the official teachings of churches, although it does affect that, but I'm talking about the way people think about religion, their own religion, other people's religion, and so forth. I wonder if this may at least be the beginnings of an answer to the question you raised, and also account for Eric's perception that maybe there isn't such a thing. Hard enough to define the public square, let alone where Christianity can or should or whatever fit in. Maybe people just don't see it as being it is or even social critique. It's Jesus is my Savior.
Yeah. Well, I know this isn't meant to be a full response to your point. It reminds me, though, and maybe you're familiar with this book that came out just by Ross Delbert in the New York Times, Bad Religion, which is his sort of contention that he's Catholic, that Orthodox Christianity has been under such assault that there's such a void in our culture relative to Orthodox Christianity that is being filled by, in some sense, what you just described. So yeah, it's
Don't impose your faith on me, and I'll know this.
yeah. I mean, it's just and
But then the question is, which is the cause and which is the effect?
Yeah.
Michael, your suggestion is the cause is assumptions about religion that have driven religion out. So I'm not sure about Douthit's book.
I'm willing to say to consider it as in a very complex
Right, sure,
way.
sure.
Because there's nothing necessary about this. I mean, in the early church, there was a strong notion of faith as a therapeutic kind of idea. They had to do with, how is it I form myself so I can live the right kind of life, a very personal thing. And at the same time, that was strongly integrated with the notion of, well, there's a cultural critique. There's a lot of examples of the church, but the one that sticks out to me, which is kind of interesting in light of some of our contemporary debates, is what you find in the evidence of the martyrologies, as well as the writings of some of the church fathers, with respect to the social status of women. The Christian intellectuals in the early church defended the social autonomy of women. Why? Because there were women who wanted to choose to live a religious life and dedicate themselves for religious reasons to virginity, but under Roman law, the pater familias had a kind of authority within the family such that the daughters of in a family were legally obligated to honor the desire of their fathers to marry and make these familial alliances that were legally recognized that that the family needed in the judgment of the father. And that, of course, was a clash. I mean, you can't dedicate yourself to virginity, but also be carrying on the family policies and connections through marriage. And Christianity defended that as a public policy, right? I mean, the idea was this was a critique of Roman law, but at the same time, it was strongly integrated with a very personal side of religion. So and that didn't seem to be something that was at war within Christianity. But now, very often, I mean, you get the impression from a lot of Christians, it's sort of like, well, what you need to do is to pay attention to yourself and to reform yourself, and society's going to take care of itself. The economy's going to take care of itself. So but we need to work on the self. And it's not that there isn't some measure of truth there, but that does seem to be emphasizing something where you have a conflict between the import of Christianity for public policy, for larger cultural issues, and the import of the faith for one's personal development. Margaret?
I'm just interested in this thought that Dr. threw out about the possibility of, and it's not clear, my question.
Nothing I say ever really
No, I know my question. So, the idea that the argumentation rooted in original sin would tend to eventually, I think it's eventually lean left kind of socially.
That was the hunch that I was moving toward, yeah.
Yeah, and that natural law would then tend to be right. And because the one is more geared towards fixing what's wrong.
Maybe pointing out what's wrong and then providing the solutions.
While the other is ordered, is more focused on ordering people for the higher virtue.
That's kind of where
Okay,
I think you can make the case that natural law has been used in both directions. I mean, on the one hand, right now, it's oftentimes associated with rights of life. But certainly in civil rights, for example, that would have been a more radical liberal idea that would be attached to natural law.
it seems like a real dichotomy isn't the original sin versus natural law. It's natural law versus positivism, or natural law versus everything. Natural law versus subjectivity, natural law versus everything. So, I mean, I didn't see that as a natural dichotomy. To me, it's almost all conservatives now will gravitate toward natural law. And I think they'll have a strong sense that original sin is a problem, right? But I guess I don't see that particular split. But Dr. Dillon?
Yeah, I'm going to throw a historian piece in here about whether this is the debate in American culture, which is that within U.S. religious and cultural history, there's this tension, there's, I think, a deep assumption that the human person rightly oriented will know what, in fact, natural law or the higher law is. You see this in Thoreau when he writes on civil disobedience and some other things, and that it's that's a really significant piece here. And when we look at the erosion of public intellectuals, and it's interesting to me that we don't have a lot of them after what Philip Hammond at Santa Barbara refers to as the third disestablishment, which really goes in the direction of religion is an almost entirely personal quest, that public intellectuals are people who believed that we had a capacity for self-deception about whether or not we knew what the higher law really was. And that there also was a sense of the shared common community that made it worth the while to try and do critique from the perspective of a religious or value system, even as we're aware of that penchant for self-deception. So I think there's a closer connection between trying to get at what is the natural law and a nuanced understanding of original sin in American culture that we have to consider. I think the questions that Dale has raised are really interesting, and the ones you've raised, but I think it's a more complicated dynamic in culture.
I mean, isn't it true that Protestants who emphasize the doctrine of original sin, they're often suspicious of natural law theories precisely because their view is sin blinds us to. I mean, they look at Romans chapter 1, for example, and say, all that can be known of God is revealed in his creation, and yet what happens? Our sinfulness intrudes, and we don't see any of it. And so, I mean, I actually see a parallel between natural law, the notion that original sin blinds us to the truths of the natural law, and also the claim that, I mean, you see this in modern evangelicals, especially fundamentalists, that sin blinds us to knowing truly about the natural world, for example. So this suspicion of science is often motivated by the same theology of original sin.
You raised an interesting point. I think when you mentioned that, I think it was talking about Schlesinger. It echoed something that Lewis talked about in the abolition of man. And one of his, where he said, the reason I'm a Democrat is not because I trust him, but because I don't trust him. And so there isn't, I mean, that's not really a natural law, right? Although Lewis was died in the wall natural law opponent. But for him, the reason behind the foundation of a democratic society was a vivid awareness of the fact that we were real school laws. I think you're right. There's a real connection.
If I can just throw in one more piece. Mark Knoll, who I consider probably the premier Protestant American church historian, is brilliant. He's written an essay in which he argues that finally the tradition that's won out in the United States is the holiness tradition.
That has won out.
That has won out, and that it's not actually the Calvinist or Reformed tradition that has shaped the culture, but that it's the holiness tradition, which is one that very much goes to the trust in the internal experience as being able to overcome sin and know the natural law. And I think that complicates what a public intellectual can be, because your public intellectuals don't tend to come out of traditions that are profoundly just interior.
No, I think those are great comments. I think David is exactly right, that the traditional Protestant skepticism of Aquinas and Scholasticism and reason itself, is rooted. You see that to me in evil and the whole issue of self-deception the church is talking about. Again, I think it's just for all the reasons that you've been saying, sort of running upstream against the broad forces within American culture. And again, I guess where it gets hard because of all the variations of Protestantism that are out there to sort of talk in general terms about where are they or what are they doing, and probably makes this not a particularly productive vein to put down, yeah, but I mean, I think it's that dynamic that I found so interesting.
Well, we're out of time. Let's thank our presenters.